Lutheran, Ian Saville.
Right, okay, well I won't use the microphone, because I don't really need it. Okay, my question really relates to the first thing that Ollie said, that it's clear now that in order to avoid catastrophic climate change of over 2 degrees, we have to leave about 80% of the fossil fuels that are underground, we have to leave those fossil fuels there. And that's a problem. It's a problem for us, but it's a big problem for the oil companies and the petrochemical companies and the car companies and all those people who are committed to exploring for more oil, more gas, all these things that will destroy our environment. And it's only going to be possible to stop that oil being and gas and fossil fuels being extracted if there is some regulatory framework from the government to stop it happening. So what is your government, if you form a government, what would your government do to curb the power of these companies to stop this damaging pollution?
Okay, thank you. Alan, can I start with you?
Sure. Okay, so on a regulatory framework, you've got me there. I'm not a regulator in that respect. I'd be coming to people like you, Ian, to give me answers on how we would do that regulation, because I think it's something that I wouldn't want to wing on a night and talk about it, but I think we should, because I think there's been a long-term, if you like, conspiracy in this area. There's been a long-term conspiracy between, if you like, the automobile industry. I think they're a dangerous conspiracy. I'm not thinking of some kind of secret deal. There's a desire to keep petrol cars and to do all of this. I mean, think about it for a second. This is one of the few areas in our society where we get no choice, really. There's very little choice. It's starting to come on the market now in terms of electric cars, other forms of things that you do. You pop into almost any service station, you get the choice of petrol, diesel. That's where you're really at in terms of this argument. There has been a long-term trend that's been perpetuated by a combination. It started off in America. I just watched a very interesting documentary about the history, for example, of light rail, in fact, of trams in California in the early years of the 20th century. And there was a few people would realise it now. If you go to California, the car is king. But if you were to have gone there in the early years of the 20th century, there was an burgeoning tram network that was, or trolley bus technically, that was completely overturned by the automobile industry in its pursuit for getting oil onto people's mind first and foremost. So for me, this is a long-term trend. I think we need that diversity. We need to stop the carbon side. We need to stop the extraction of minerals when we have already got good solutions. I think what you're seeing now with electric technology for cars is fascinating in itself, how that's developing. Of course, how you get electricity is the next question, and again, renewables must be the answer for that. But this offers us a much healthier future. So again, on regulation, I'll come to you, but you've got a supporter in the sense of where we want to go with that.
Okay, thank you. And Ollie?
I won't add too much to my opening remarks, but we're currently in a situation where just this week in the budget, for instance, last week in the budget rather, George Osborne announced tax breaks to the oil and gas industry amounting to £1.3 billion. And he declared last year of his wish to extract every last drop of oil and gas from North Sea from North Sea fields. And that is wholly incompatible with the measures which everyone on the panel has so far to some extent expressed are necessary. So climate change is the classic market failure, if you like, to put it in those terms, and therefore I think a strong and robust deal at the international level is something that the UK government must argue for, not only that all governments agree to a 2-degree, limiting climate change to a 2-degree rise, but they take into account the historic emissions of those countries who have done most to cause climate change.
Thank you, Dawn.
I think it was quite a long question. I think that if you don't mind, I just want to read some of what the Labour Party will do. So basically, the Labour Party will put sustainability back on top of the agenda. That means that we will invest in green technology and green industry. It means that we will make sure that we'll be more imaginative when we're going for procurement contracts, which means that companies who are green are more likely to get a contract under a Labour government. So that means subsequently that there would be a restriction on companies that want to farm. I think will fracking come under your question?
Yeah, it would, yeah.
Yeah, so as you know, the Labour Party put in some safeguards around fracking, which the government has now tried to curb and ensure that it doesn't go through. So it got passed in Parliament, and now they're trying to throw it all out the window, basically. So what the Labour Party said, they'll put some safeguards around the fracking industry so that companies will not just be able to come in and frack without licence and without having certain safeguards. So there's a lot of safeguards that the Labour Party has said they'll put into the procedure and process.
Just taking up the fracking point first.
We'll come back to fracking.
Okay. Well, it's again a very complicated question, but I think taking a local perspective first, there are just very basic things that I think could make a difference in terms of consumption and reducing fossil fuels, namely trying to develop a far greater emphasis on public transport, making the public transport services much better locally, and also making them cheaper. I'm astonished when I started working in London in the 1990s that the prices then were not exactly cheap. But now, getting a travel card from Croydon to come here just for one day was £12, and that strikes me as a lot of money. And going just to the south coast with a fast train is close on to £100 return. And I think that for most people is very expensive. So I think that's a disincentive straight away to changing our behaviour, and much easier to drive, much cheaper to drive if public transport is so much more expensive than the car or bus. So that's one thing I think that would be a great focus to look at. Also expanding recycling as well, recycling of food products, plastic products, all kinds of things we use every day in the home. That is just beginning to be developed in this country. But I can compare how much further that is developed in Germany. Much greater emphasis on recycling of absolutely everything. And there are also incentives to do that for ordinary people, whether it be beer cans or the plastic containers for your food, everything pretty much. So just very simple, basic things that will make it, will give ordinary people an incentive to right. And finally, trying to develop to give incentives for green businesses locally and nationally.
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, we need a holistic and ambitious approach. So if it's fossil fuels you want to reduce the use of, then certainly we ban fracking. There's no question about having a nicer licensing regime. It is a fossil fuel intensive technology, and there's no space for it. There's no time to be using that kind of business like there's no tomorrow business as usual approach. In terms of the regulatory regime, one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet is the impact of the current economic system. So all the parties, all the anti-austerity parties, talk about growth as if it's infinite in this Keynesian economic model, as if there are no consequences of all this overconsumption. And it's not just taking oil or gas out and combusting it, that's the problem. It's plastics. It's all the way through everything that we're doing in life in terms of overconsumption, plastics use, our salving our consciences by exporting our carbon production to China to make endless amounts of crapula and then having it imported back here for Christmas for our kids and it ending up on the scrap heap. So yes, we need to think about the waste cycle, we need to reduce that, we need the 3 R's. reduce, recycle and reuse. And there are initiatives going on even in this borough where people are putting up furniture, they're telling people about it, free cycle, come and get this, pick this up. That's reuse. That's the best form of recycling. But we need to lower our consumption, and there are 3 other areas across the country. You can think of transport, you can think of housing, you can think of industry. At every step, we need to be thinking about the level of carbon-intensive production, and we need to clamp down on it. Also, just to show Brent's priorities, in this council, they've got rid of the green waste for proper green waste. What's going to be happening to that? People are going to be, they can't afford £40 a year to do that. So where is that compostable waste going to end up? Are they actually going to be doing more of it? Are they going to be paving over their own front gardens? This is a very short-sighted, in every action, local government, national government, they're not thinking about it. It's not on the radar, that's why.
Okay, thank you. So I've had a couple of questions about TTIP. So with Jim Rowland here. Microphone in, okay.
I'm going to just speak once.
Good thing.
Yes, TTIP is the US-EU free trade deal currently being negotiated in secret. And thanks to leaks, or initially WikiLeaks, we know that it includes, it's going to lead to weaker environmental and health safeguards for goods, as well as less scope for new ones to be introduced. It includes investor-state dispute settlement, which will allow big companies to sue governments, as Philip Morris is already suing 2 governments that have similar provisions in other free trade treaties. There's a similar deal being negotiated between the EU and Canada called CETA, with similar provisions, and economists have said the actual economic and job benefits of TTIP in its present form are likely to be very slender, much less than promised. So will the candidates oppose these treaties in their current form?
Thanks. Is that me?
Yes, is a simple answer to your question. Yes, we're on record of saying so. TTIP is actually quite dangerous in a number of areas, the NHS being one of them as well, and the Labour Party has said that the NHS will be removed from TTIP, which stands for the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, just in case people wonder what TTIP is. Yeah, the NHS will be taken out of it. It's actually something that needs a lot more time and investigation into the consequences of signing up to TTIP and what it actually means, and the Labour Party is committed to that, and I'm committed to that also.
Thank you for the question. I can say that in the last 2 weeks I've had many emails, probably 75 to 100 or possibly more, about this issue alone. And I have written back to every single email in great detail, because one of the aspects of it was the impact upon the NHS. Having worked in the NHS for 20 years and having seen the way over the years the NHS has been at various points a political football that's been kicked around to the detriment of the NHS with various reorganisations. I could probably speak for a whole evening on this. I'm completely opposed to TTIP, both in terms of what it might do to the NHS, but also in terms of what it could do for local businesses and national businesses. As you, I'm sure, know, UKIP is one of the major political thrusts of UKIP is to come out of the EU, and therefore any sort of extension of the kind of business ideas that TTIP represent are actually a complete anathema to me. And so I can assure you and anybody who is passionate about this issue that I would be fighting tooth and nail to make sure it doesn't happen.
Well, I don't know whether Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership does help. It sounds like very innocuous. What it's about essentially, I quite like seeing that people at the back there, if you don't mind. What it's about is denuding citizens' rights of recall for decisions which are detrimental to them. If you think of the Boyle medical disaster, the disaster that's happening Still, as we speak, generation after generation are suffering as a result of 30 years ago, Union Carbide's negligence. Union Carbide haven't been brought to book. The US and other multinational companies are delighted at the TTIP negotiations. And when our politicians even here say that they're against it, you need to ask what they're doing in the European Parliament, whether it's UKIP or Labour. I was on a platform not long ago with Claude Moraes, and he was one of the key negotiators in favour of it. So he certainly wasn't coming out against it. So you need to ask, what are our parliamentarians doing in the European Parliament? That's where most of the action is. What is going to happen? Of course, we are full square against that. We need more authority and recall and judicial recourse when our corporations fail us, whether they're squandering the planetary resources or they're not giving a damn about the negative consequences of their workforce, who are suffering the consequences of bad working conditions. So yes, we're against TTIP, and it's part of the neoliberal agenda, which, as far as I'm aware, last time I checked, all the main political parties are still signed up to.
Well, I think all the parties have spoken of the NHS issue. The government are on record as having said exactly the same thing. The idea that any privatisation of the NHS will occur through this scheme is absolutely not true. The NHS will in fact look exactly as it is today. No difference at all. That's what the official government statement. So on that, the Labour Party and the Conservatives are clearly united on that. In general terms, yes, I'm certainly in favour of free trade. However, I can't understand any treaty that would remove environmental and health safeguards. I find that extraordinary in this kind of approach. But in general terms, if we look at the benefits of free trade treaties in the past, such as this, let's assume we can fix those, which we absolutely must do. If you look at something like NAFTA, for example, the North American Free Trade Treaty that came out a few years ago in the 90s, that's helped very much, Mexico in particular, develop economically and move forward that way. And I think this is about benefits not just for us, but for developing countries coming through as well. And I think that's what we have to remember. Free trade does help everyone in that sense. And maybe the Greens are against that, but certainly I'm not.
Thank you. So I think we've got a couple of questions here on air pollution. So there's Ian there, who submitted a question on air pollution.
Yeah, what will you do to reduce air pollution in London streets? Simple question. Or Brent Street.
Somebody, Shahrar?
Yeah, I mean, great question. If any of you happen to have this evening's copy of the Evening Standard, there's a nice little article there by Natalie Bennett. So the Greens are focused on air pollution because it has a massive impact on people in terms of their health, their breathing, increased incidences, maybe 10,000, an estimate, deaths a year in London alone, rising to 50,000 across the country. That's pretty big numbers. The main contributing factor to this is the motor car and the amount of noxious gases that we're spewing out on a daily basis. The United Kingdom has been held to account by the European Commission year in, year out as the worst capital city across Europe. And when are we going to have to face that legal challenge? Why does it take that to get us to do anything? And we're not doing enough. Eventually we need to move. We must be moving towards more sustainable transport. That means modal, human scale options, walking and cycling. We need to prioritise that, have more dedicated lanes, make sure that we don't just build roads. So when Conservative Party tells you that they want to increase road building, how is that going to help the environment? When the other parties are telling you that they're still considering airport expansion, how is that going to help the environment? Transport is the main contributor to air pollution, and we need to clamp down on that.
I would endorse some of the points already made. Again, coming back to cars and also lorries, if I can be allowed to go outside of London just for a second to make my point, I often come down the M20 and it's a very hazardous exercise because of the number of lorries. Now in London, I mean, I think Boris Johnson, one of his good ideas, I think, was the congestion charge. I think that, I'm talking about, thank you, it's a correction, the error there. But anyway, a good idea, and I think that could possibly be expanded so that we have, for example, in Germany, at the weekends, on a Sunday, lorries are not allowed to drive at all for business use. Now, this type of restriction, again, you have to be very careful before introducing draconian measures, but the bottom line is to try and reduce car use, reduce lorry use throughout London so that you have cleaner air, also increase incentives for businesses, factories, etc., having tax relief and financial incentives for cleaning their emissions for their processes like Park-Royal, for example. That's pretty much would be a start anyway.
Because of the North Circular, Brent suffers from really poor air pollution. Welsh Harp is one of the places that we have extremely poor air pollution, and some of it's around the schools as well, which is quite worrying. So what we have to do is we do have to clean up the air, and what Shahrar has said in regards to the holistic approach, we can look at what Labour's record is on this. So Labour created the car scrappage scheme to encourage electric vehicles in 2009, announced the feed-in tariff scheme in 2009, and also one of the great things was the decent home programmes. And I remember going around and we were helping to install new boilers in people's houses, and they got £400 off new boilers. And the decent home scheme was really important because it also reduces people's need to go to hospital if they live in a warm home. So there's all kinds of social benefit to making sure that we have an environmentally friendly but safe and warm home for people. So Labour's record is actually a holistic approach to clean air. We just have to do more of it.
Yeah, and I think if you're looking at what's happening, the trend, thankfully, is definitely towards reducing motor use. You're looking at congestion charge expansion, which has been resisted in some cities around the UK, but I think everyone in London's come to accept it and even support it in terms of being something that is a natural part of our daily lives now. And that's something that's got to continue. I think we have to invest more in public transport. It's important. I'm pleased to see that, of course, the scheme, the HS2 scheme, that's of course the rail link that's going to go all the way to Manchester and beyond eventually, is key to this as well. I think again, this is reducing the number of people on the roads. The idea being again that you can travel far quicker to places on business trips. You don't need to travel by car. Once again, this is going to have impacts on air pollution, but we do have to constantly strive to do better. Yes, it is a start in various ways. We need to improve locally. I think it's important as well. We do have problems, obviously, with the roads network and other things. Here, it's a shame that in some of the budget cuts that the Labour Council made, they did do a particular focus locally in Brent on cutting environmental teams and other things. I think that's a deep shame for Brent and may lead to unfortunate repercussions going forwards as well.
Thanks. Just to pick up on a couple of things, the scale of the problem in the UK is quite staggering, and the figures that we know about are for particulate matter, PM25 it's called, and these bits emitted primarily by motor car engines, which just sit in the bottom of your lung and don't leave, and it's hugely problematic for respiratory illnesses. There are carcinogens as well, and we know that these are causing 29,000 early deaths a year. What we also know is that nitrogen oxide is a huge problem, and that the figures are expected to be released this year for the impact of NO2, which will, as I think was alluded to earlier, get us up to about 60,000 early deaths a year. And that's second only to the impacts of smoking in terms of premature deaths. So air pollution, I think, has sometimes been a bit neglected in the environmental debate, but tackling air pollution is wholly incompatible with a massive expansion of roads. And at the moment, the road scheme proposed by the government is of a scale of that proposed in the 90s. It's enormous, and it is not compatible. And here in London, similarly, river crossings, several proposed new river crossings are likely to be road bridges, but that will only increase traffic. We know that new roads causes increased traffic. It doesn't ease congestion, it causes more journeys to be made. So these are the problems we face, and particularly in London, the European limits on what's considered a safe level of air pollution, which used to be met by 2010, and we had an extension at that stage until 2015, and it now looks like in Leeds, Birmingham and London, we are not going to be operating at a safe level of pollution until at some point after 2030. So people who are born now are going to spend the first 15 years of their life living in a city in air which is not safe to breathe. So we need radical solutions, and I completely agree with some of the comments on the panel that the transport use is the most key thing that needs to be addressed, as well as fossil generation, obviously.
Thank you. I have a question from Viv now.
Hi. There are proposals for fracking in Park Royal. Fracking cannot be made safe by regulations, and it is a fossil fuel. Do you support fracking there or anywhere else in Brent, yes or no?
Stephen, start with you.
Again, just to say, many emails about this in the last 24 hours. And I have to say, it's a core question that I want to address is my personal view that unequivocally I would absolutely try to